What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
The Asian American right wing is trying to grow and consolidate power, which you can see in the growth of the Republican Party here in San Francisco, where we have about as many Asians as white people. Alongside this growth is the Falun Gong, which is a cult that was banned by the Chinese government back in 1999. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, considers Falun Gong to be one of the 5 poisons. That's the Communist Party's own version of the FBI's most wanted list. As the guest on today's episode, Chris Lee writes, the wealthy leader of the Falun Gong now resides in upstate New York at a massive 427-acre compound known as Dragon Springs, which includes a 75-foot temple, several colleges, and a training facility for dancers that perform in another FLG-associated production, Shen Yun. Li Hongzhu, his teachings and writings cover a sprawling range of subject matters, warning against the dangers of rock music and modern life, fearing VPNs and anime, predicting the divine annihilation of homosexuality, condemning the depravity of race mixing, and completely forbidding the use of modern medicine. You've almost definitely seen ads promoting Shen Yun, the dance company. And in San Francisco, other examples of the Falun Gong in the wild include Falun Dafa, which is the Tai Chi movement classes where a bunch of Asians are moving in sync. For example, in front of places like City Hall in San Francisco. They also promote other movements like the Free Tibet movement and the Taiwan and Uyghur independence movements. Anything that aligns with the anti-CCP agenda. Last but not least, another major part of this soft power project of the Falun Gong is the Epoch Times newspaper, which is a free newspaper and multimedia news outlet with subdivisions that have names like American Thought Leaders and California Insider. And the point is to spread anti-CCP messaging. It's all sprinkled in with articles and videos that are pretty similar in ideology to the right-wing manosphere that is dominated by podcasters and streamers like Logan Paul, Joe Rogan, Sean Ryan, and Jordan Peterson. That means that, among other things, it's anti-DEI, anti-vaccine, pro-landlord, anti-groomer, and pro-keto diet. I asked Chris to come on and talk more about the emerging Chinese and Asian American right after he gave a paper on this very topic at the American Studies Conference in Baltimore late last year. So it's 2025 and there are no more newsstands on the streets of San Francisco to carry the Epoch Times. So RIP to being able to get a paper version of the most right-wing thing printed that you could have gotten on the streets of San Francisco as of a few months ago. And I'm here with Chris Lee to discuss failure of the Epoch Times to bring back newspapers. Thank you for joining me. We are actually going to be talking more about right-wing Asian Americans, right-wing Chinese Americans, and recently immigrated Chinese people in the Bay Area and beyond. And this is something that I asked you to do after you gave a paper at the American Studies Conference around the use of transness as a sort of a villainous figure that right-wing Asian American forces are using to prop up a larger political project, using transness as sort of like a wedge issue in not dissimilar ways for that good old white American right wing has been using them. But there are particularities that I think are pretty interesting that spoke about in this on the panel that I'm referencing. So first off, to start with some of the basics, could you discuss how you came to be interested in this paper, or interested enough to write this paper? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I I grew up in Orange County, which is a one of the battlegrounds or maybe like a hotbed for Chinese American conservative activity. Basically, everyone I know who's around my age or even younger, their parents who are either Chinese American speaking, bilingual, but mostly speak in Chinese, consume Chinese language media content, their whole media landscape is like totally consumed by the Epoch Times, New Tang Dynasty, and that is really scary, but also speaks to the reach of this relatively small media company that has consumed like a huge swath of older Chinese Americans, Taiwanese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Asian Americans, basically, who don't get their news from anywhere else. I was most interested in, actually looking at wading into this toxic muck of what seems like a mix of real articles mixed with kind of like AI generated or clickbait articles. And I specifically looked at what was called like a series of transgender reports, which really seemed to take off like in the past few years and published in the various languages that the Epoch Times publishes in. So English. I mostly looked at English and Chinese, and I looked at the differences between the English news reports and the Chinese news reports because there were some differences in what they published and how they were stirring up moral panic against trans stuff. So that was kind of the basis of where I was looking, and also trying to kind of figure out how the Epoch Times has become, one of the most distributed newspapers in the U.S. Like you basically, if you're in Orange County and you go to, I don't know, a grocery store or something, there'll probably be someone who will hand you an Epoch Times newspaper, especially if you look Asian.
Yeah, and it's like one of the few news sources that, like you said, it's translated into so many different languages, and has become a major source of news for not just Chinese Americans, but because it is available. I mean, I guess, ostensibly translation software will make this less of a barrier in the future, but for a long time, they were devoting funding to translating it into languages like Vietnamese, and people who didn't have other options were going to the Epoch Times, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said he reads it every day. In a lot of ways, they're very vulnerable right now because there's been a whole anti-laundering and legal cases against them. And in other ways, their worldview, which we can talk about down the line, but their worldview, which is, very quote unquote traditional, very anti-vaccine, very homophobic, transphobic. We're living in the Epoch Times era of US government and of this very sad nation. So they're both ridiculous, and they're also like everything they publish is a crystal ball into like the future of how the state is working right now.
The protagonists of the paper, like the people that you see on the website for the Epoch Times, like every day, are people like Trump, are people like RFK Jr., who's, make America healthy again. It feels like he pulled the Make America Healthy Again playbook from pages of the Epoch Times. And one of the things that they do, as you hinted at, was to present this sort of prescription for cultural regression. We need to get back to this time that was more authentic, that was more family friendly, that espouses more traditional values. And so dictating what counts as authentic is a major part of their sort of project. Part of their project is to get to define what counts as authentically Chinese or Chinese American, with them trying to like put transness on the table as this wedge issue. They are defining what counts as authentic. They're even to the point where they're sort of associating transness with whiteness to distance transness from Asians or Chinese Americans.
Yeah, so the paper that I wrote only looks at the kind of series of transgender reports that are characteristically alarmist about the influence of, LGBTQ ideology in schools. It's actually a kind of, earlier version of Chinese American conservative protest or reaction to LGBTQ ideology. We saw this with Prop 8 and the gay marriage campaign in California. Chinese American Christian conservatives organized heavily against, I can't even remember what side it was. It was either for or against Prop A, but against the marriage equality side. And there was this impression that LGBTQ ideology was, invading the Chinese American familial home as this sacred space for traditionalism. It's really kind of like it forms an interior ethnic space that any intrusion that could be like trans ideology, it could be LGBTQ, it could be gay marriage, violates. And so this is just a kind of extension, a new target for not even, it's not an argument that the Epoch Times or the Falun Gong people invented. Chinese American evangelical Christians have always been a thing. Asian American evangelical Christians have been a thing. It's just that the religious lines are not that clear cut, so the Epoch Times actually has a lot of allegiances with what we would consider like kind of Chinese Christian demographics. Oftentimes the transgender reports talk about a Chinese immigrant Christian family, right? And you would think that, well, aren't these Falun Gong people? Why would they be Christian and Falun Gong practitioners? Those lines are not that, they don't need to be that clear cut. From my vantage point, what they're interested in is kind of securing strategic alliances and gaining more political or cultural power. And that can mean, forming religious alliances. It definitely means like endorsing Trump and essentially, viewing him as a kind of messianic figure that will destroy China. That's not an exaggeration. They have this idea that Trump will destroy communist China and re-enshrine a China before communism. But that's the Epoch Times, that's the transgender reports. Obviously, they're doing this in a lot of different cultural contexts, right? So we have to talk about Shen Yun. There's no getting around Shen Yun and its viral marketing. I went to a show for research purposes.
Doing God's work, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of their most successful and popular ways of trying to persuade the American public, the global public, really, that they are the kind of arbiters of Chinese authentic culture and that there's no actual version of Shen Yun that could take place in China.
It is an extraordinary kind of, like soft power play that, I mean, it should be in the encyclopedia as like the clearest example of soft power that we have in 2025 to me. When you went, what did you see?
So they're very careful about not letting people document. So there's no recordings allowed, but many folks, not just me, have gone and talked about like the bizarre world that you're entering. The way that I would describe it is like mediocre to average Chinese opera, which you would see like basically anywhere. You could see it in Beijing, for instance. There's like Beijing opera troupes who would probably do what they do at an even better level. But the basic structure is that there's a white guy who speaks Chinese and an Asian American woman who serve as the hosts. And they introduce each act beforehand. And their whole thing is that they say, what you're about to see can't be seen in China because of communism. It's been erased by China. Probably what they are implying is that the Cultural Revolution and the influence of Marxist ideology and communism has destroyed culture to the point that what you're seeing is impossible to see in China. And of course, people who are dance scholars or people who have just been to China will know that's not true. You can see the kind of acrobatic dancing in China, probably at an even better level. But the first half is variations on Chinese opera that would tell stories about like the Monkey King, who's a very familiar character in Chinese folklore. And then there's like kind of bizarre interludes where you might see a figure who looks like a charismatic leader who has the face of Falun Gong's leader Li Hongzhi, and you might see him like kind of flying around in the background. And there's like dancers, and then there's like kind of projection behind the dancers, and so they have these kind of computer generated images, including this like flying around leader who pops in once in a while. And then halfway through the show, there's a singer who sings in Chinese, and there's English lyrics that pop out, and that's the moment that most people really get weirded out if they don't know anything about Shen Yun or Falun Gong, because there's lyrics like "evolution is the poison of society." You know, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not exactly sure, but there's references to a kind of anti-science traditionalist worldview, and it's completely, you know, not elaborated. So you're reading these lyrics and you're like, oh, this is weird. Second half, there's even clearer references to Falun Gong. I wouldn't call it propaganda, but you know, it's kind of their worldview. So there's a performance in which Falun Gong practitioners are beat up by Chinese Communist police, and one of the characters also has their organs stolen, their organs harvested, because that's one of the other, you know, accusations that Falun Gong practitioners have made, which is that Chinese government is stealing their organs and selling them. I think in earlier iterations of Shen Yun, there was a zombie Marx head that would come out and try to destroy China, and then, you know, the Falun Gong practitioners would do some lovely hand movements and send Marx away. I didn't get to see the zombie Marx head. I have had some friends who say that they saw it, and there's other like kind of journalistic reports. But that's essentially, you know, it's maybe 2.5 hours long. I would say pretty clear about its ideological worldview. And I would say 80% of it is actually pretty boring. You know, like it's people doing Chinese opera like moves, and it's entertaining enough, and it gets old after a while.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Excellent report back. Unfortunate thing about these soft power plays is like it does more than just, you know, attempt to inject sort of like popular culture into the US mainstream. But like, I know there are Congress people who are using some of the propaganda that they receive from an organization like Shen Yun to justify increased militarization. So, I mean, it's not just a vibe that they're creating, like that vibe is translating into literal military spending.
Yeah. I think there's a bill in Congress right now called the Falun Gong Protection Act. You can look it up. It's HR 4132. I'm not sure. I don't think it's been passed. It sanctions and imposes restrictions on anyone who is involved in the harvesting of organs in China, in the illegal or involuntary harvesting of organs. And just to kind of clarify, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that there's like any organized organ harvesting in China of specifically Falun Gong practitioners. I think there was some. It's actually really hard to determine like what's the truth between the propaganda machine that is the Chinese government, you know, because not everything the Chinese government says is trustworthy either. But definitely what the Falun Gong practitioners and what the US government says about Falun Gong practitioners is not trustworthy either. So we're always, I mean, for me, I'm always trying to kind of find, if not the truth, then some version of reality that's in between these positions, which are like Falun Gong is an evil cult that must be destroyed, and China is an evil government that must be destroyed.
Right. Yeah. The gray space, what we're all looking for. You looked at both versions of the Epoch Times, like you were looking at the Chinese version as well. And you did find that there were distinctions, which I think is interesting. What were those distinctions, and who were they trying to like play to?
Yeah, so the Epoch Times has become a media empire. It's actually really hard to historicize all of this. You know, you can start from multiple points of time. Like, for instance, Shen Yun was founded in 2006. That's its own nonprofit. The Epoch Times was founded in 2000. That's another nonprofit. We could talk about New Tang Dynasty, which is another like a TV and media company that's also started by Falun Gong practitioners. None of these are officially related to Falun Gong, but they were started by practitioners, and they oftentimes have overlap and alignment with Falun Gong ideology. So at this point in time, speaking from the kind of 2023, 2024, now 2025 vantage point, the Epoch Times has grown massively from a pretty fringe outlet that, was mainly seen as this kind of disposable newspaper handed out in various strange Asian American contexts or non-Asian American contexts. And they were legitimized by Trump. So they secured a lot of political power under the Trump administration, and even in 2020 during Trump's first re-election campaign, because if you remember 2020, that's when COVID happened. There was an appetite for anti-Chinese content, right? So the Epoch Times was very happy to spread anti-vaccine conspiracy, and also was one of the first publications that promoted this idea that COVID was like a bioweapon or a lab-grown virus that was released upon the world. They gained a lot of legitimacy and a lot of power in that time, a lot of money. They started getting more donations from not just Chinese conservative forces, but Christian conservative forces. Their readership expanded greatly. Their political power expanded greatly. And I think in the midst of that, they were able to create a market both for their Chinese language content, which is still, has a lot of traction. It's probably the main media landscape for folks who get their news from WeChat or WhatsApp, which we can talk about later, older Chinese Americans or Chinese language American readers. And then there was this other market, which is this conservative MAGA right-wing crowd who will happily consume the Epoch Times content because it confirms all of their worldviews of being virulently transphobic, very anti-communist, and full, quote unquote, for parental rights. So what I looked at with the series of transgender reports was trying to see the Epoch Times is tailoring their version of transphobic moral panic for different audiences. They have a whole documentary production outlet now. I think some of their most popular documentaries are The Real Story of January 6th. And there's this other documentary called Gender Transformation, The Untold Realities, which is about, the fear and the panic around gender, quote unquote, gender ideology. So the English language reports and the documentary Gender Transformation are really your conventional transphobic moral panic story. Families having their children taken away from them by gender ideology, being radicalized in schools, being told that LGBTQ is good, and then, driving this wedge between parents and their deluded children.
I liked the note about how anime and furries were kind of, marked the sort of path to losing your kids, sort of.
Yeah. So there's like dozens of these stories, and interestingly, as you alluded to, the technology often plays a role. So there's the story of a kid being radicalized, generally through schools, public schools, or the internet. So there's a mention of Reddit, the subreddit egg_IRL. There is the use of VPNs, or virtual private networks. That might be a sign that your kid is becoming trans. There's interest in furries and furry communities, which also have a close relationship to the internet and internet subcommunities. And all of these are, warning signs that your kid might be becoming trans. And then there's an intervention where the parent says, okay, I have to pull my kid back from this. It's often described as like an abyss or like a pit, some kind of scary, deep, like a trap or something of transgenderism, what they would call it. So that's like kind of the conventional, typical story of transgender moral panic or transphobic moral panic. And the Chinese versions were very similar, but they contained this thread of using Chinese tradition, quote unquote tradition, because what is tradition? But they paired these stories with using Chinese tradition to combat transgender ideology. So oftentimes the stories that were published in English were kind of well-known quote unquote parent activists. You could find their stories. They were parents who were fighting against activist judges or public schools, or in some cases, their ex-wives or ex-partners who were more supportive of quote unquote transgender ideology.
Right.
The Chinese language reports were always anonymous. For lack of a better word, they were just very like almost like self-orientalizing. They were
Hmm.
always telling a story around the Chinese New Year, telling a story of my kid used to be so Chinese and enjoy Chinese things, and then these demonic white children told them that they can be LGBTQ, and now they hate me. And they
Hmm.
say I'm not that I'm being racist or I'm being woke or anti woke or something. So that was one really interesting difference, was that the generic parents of these transphobic English reports were transformed into like Chinese immigrants, and specifically Chinese American immigrants, oftentimes who lived in California, Midwest, places where there would be a battle between Chinese American conservatives and, say, public schools or school choice, right?
Have you
And
seen any like
Mhm.
examples of them showing that they understand that there is contradiction in the fact that when they are espousing all of this anti-China rhetoric, for example, supporting Trump, who
Mhm.
was, saying China, China, China in
Mhm.
2019, 2020, and then blamed China for COVID,
Mhm.
and it was in the air. The anti-Asian sentiment was
Mhm.
sort of painting China as a villain.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, there are still so many people in the US who don't make a distinction between China and Chinese Americans, or
Mhm.
China more generally, and Asian Americans. It becomes a project that is anti-Asian American, like,
Mhm.
even though ostensibly they're trying to defend Asian
Mhm.
America and Asians from the evils of whiteness. So it's like a
Mhm.
weird contradiction there.
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence that the Epoch Times cares about the impact of anti-Chinese rhetoric on Asian Americans or Chinese Americans. I think there isn't really one ideological center for all of these groups that we've talked about, like Epoch Times, New Tang Dynasty, Shen Yun. They're really just mostly interested in fomenting this kind of anti-communist worldview. In their mind, they're more Chinese than China. Like the anti-Chinese government
Mm,
sentiment is Chinese for them because, as we've seen through Shen Yun's promotion, they represent China before communism. They represent 5,000 years of history. There's all of this rhetoric is a way of positioning themselves as what is Chineseness. And, that includes all of it includes being incompatible with transness, possibly incompatible with belief in evolution, possibly incompatible with belief in race mixing or marrying outside of your race. There's all kinds of wacky and retrograde opinions and worldviews that they're trying to position as Chinese, even when
right.
they're really not.
And if that unleashes racism against anyone who looks like them, so be it. That may be just a side effect of this anti-China
Right. And
rhetoric.
I don't think they have a view of structural racism as we would form it. I don't think they're reading the racial formation essays.
Sure.
But they do have a worldview about victimization, and I think the Stop Asian Hate campaign was probably like a huge boon for them. I think that you can trace a straight line from, people who are holding vigils for Asian hate and people who read the Epoch Times and really strongly believe in the victimized position of the Chinese American in U.S. society. But
Right.
they're not interested, in like the deprivation of resources or the vulnerability of Asian American communities. They're interested in these, like, Asians don't get enough attention in the US. Our issues aren't being heard. This kind of abstract viewpoint of generally conservative, but, not all conservative, just mostly like race first Asian American political organizing, which we've seen, in a lot of places, in a lot, anti-homeless, Chinese American anti-homeless protests after around Peter Liang,
Yep.
all kinds of, I think they've been called like WeChat protests or WhatsApp protests, which are organized around like a shared ethnic identity, but not necessarily a shared ideological position.
Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting to see, like in San Francisco, the growth of the Republican Party here.
Mm-hmm.
It's mainly Chinese Americans and like recently people who have recently immigrated, and some of these people would have voted, for Biden the last election,
Mm-hmm.
but their politics were moldable, but
Mm-hmm.
a tribal aspect of them wanting to, I guess, support whatever other people that look like them, or they feel are authentically
Mm-hmm.
within their same demographic. They'll like go to the Republican rallies now, pro-Trump
Yeah,
rallies.
and I mean the trick of the Epoch Times is that they, at least from the vantage point of like transphobic moral panic, is that they've made transgender ideology into a form of racism. So,
Mm,
because they
yeah,
position quote unquote transgenderism as incompatible with Chineseness, they're essentially, all their reports are devoted to thinking about LGBTQ issues as white issues, as issues that are being forced upon their children, being forced upon the ethnic interior, the Chinese American family, which doesn't have the same values as white America, and it's making the influence of LGBTQ issues as this form of attack on the Chinese American family and its capacity to, to hold on to its traditions, like having Lunar New Year parties or, I don't know, folding dumplings. Really,
right.
these articles are so egregious in the way that they position Chinese identity and tradition. It feels offensive in the
Like the
almost in
self-orientalizing, like you
yeah,
said.
the
Yeah,
self-orientalizing, yeah,
yeah.
and the really the moral message of these reports is that the way to like kind of pray the gay away or pray the trans away for these kids is to distance them from their white friends and to reshape their worldview around quote unquote Chinese tradition. They have to like take Chinese language classes and have Chinese parties and make sure that they're going to Chinese places, not to China because China bad. But there's
Hmm.
one of these reports that says, oh, she's going on a vacation to Taiwan, which is really great. Of course, that's also funny because Taiwan is viewed as one of the more LGBTQ friendly
Mm,
places in East Asia. But there's a way in which Chinese culture is seen as an antidote to trans influence or
right.
ideology.
Twisted nostalgia that they're trying to
Hmm.
promote. When you were researching this piece and you were reading through Epic Times, like, was there anything else that, in particular, that kind of just stood out to you as, yeah,
Hmm.
like something that was specific to the way that transness is being used as a wedge issue?
I think I was actually really hesitant to write about this topic because I didn't know if there was anything interesting worth saying. I'm really cautious about just reproducing toxic, conspiratorial, and
Mm,
moral panic media. It
sure.
feels really mentally damaging to like read these articles. But the longest one I read, which was published exclusively in Chinese, had a really fascinating ending in which the trans kid doesn't give up being trans. So their parents are like, you can't be trans anymore. We talked to your grandma, and your grandma said that, you can't just get whatever you want. A very classic Asian American story about how patience and forbearance, which are, actual values of Falun Gong, are more important than uh, impulsiveness and immediacy. So in most moral panic stories, you would expect like, okay, the kid realizes they're not trans anymore and they just go back to they convert to being cis or straight or something. In this story, the kid is like, I'm still trans, but I realize I can be reborn. I can reincarnate into the gender that I want to be, as long as I'm patient enough. And so that was the moment that I really felt there was actually something worth saying about these reports, because they're using elements of Chinese culture, particularly kind of like Buddhist or pseudo-Buddhist values, and they're transferring them and converting them to a more conventional story about trans panic. So that was like, whoa, what is going on here?
For real. Yeah. And then I remember you mentioned something else about the beauty pageants that that is part of the infrastructure.
Yeah. So we've talked about Shen Yun, which is definitely, a soft power arm. I don't even know if you could call it a soft power arm. I feel like all of these organizations are all operating within soft power. But New Tang Dynasty, which is the kind of media, the film, video arm of the Epoch Times, they host a beauty pageant called Miss NTD, and the eligibility requirements are really indicative of how this media empire is trying to construct Chineseness, right? So the eligibility standards are the person has to be 1/3 Chinese, at least. They can't have been married. They can't have given birth or have been pregnant. They can't have any visible tattoos. They also are quote unquote natural born genetic females. If you want to see how they're defining Chineseness, all you have to do is go to this beauty pageant and see exactly the criteria for how they're really, I mean, it's a kind of like race supremacy and ethno-nationalism, like these are the standards of racial purity that in basically any context you would be alarmed about. Despite the many investigations against this collection of nonprofits that constitute the Epoch Times, New Tang Dynasty, Shen Yun Network. First of all, I would not be surprised if these investigations all get dropped mysteriously, and also they are highly committed to continuing to form this political network of power. And I'm not a huge fan of like demographic or voter data, but if you look into the details of like Chinese American enclaves, there were huge swings towards Trump in the last presidential election, which I think should say something about like where we're at.
Thank you so much for coming on to discuss. I've been wanting to talk about this for a minute now, so thanks for being a friend. And I was wondering if there is a way that people can find you online or elsewhere if you want to be found.
I mean, I think so. Jasmine, who was on this show before, we are working on an article about various ways that anti-Asian attack is being twisted into attacks on property, attacks on quote unquote Chinese tradition, attacks on businesses and business interests or real estate value, right? So hopefully that will be out sometime. We'll see. We're trying to find a publication home for it, but when that comes out, you should definitely check it out.
Come back. Yeah.
Jasmine.
Yeah. That would be tight. Cool. Thank you again, Chris, and I'll talk to you very soon.
Sounds good. All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/Sad Francisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.